Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to COVID, business continuity, resilience, emergency management, anything relatable to those topics, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community plan, prepare, and respond to and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free, send me an email. You can reach me either on Voice America, the button underneath the show's graphic sends me an email. YouTube, you can send me or leave a message in the comments, or you can even find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there, so I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Longtime listeners and longtime viewers, now you'll know that I spoke at the Business Continuity Virtual World Conference in November 2020, and I expressed a desire to get some of those speakers here on the show. And if you've been watching and listening long enough, you know we got a fantastic response, and we got a lot of people coming on the show to talk about their topics and other things. And today is one of those days as well. So I want to welcome to the show the speaker with the topic, public sector organizations, a business continuity professional's biggest foe. That'll be interesting. I'd like to welcome to the show the speaker of that topic, Juliana Richardson. Juliana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, literally, we've got people around the globe who listen and watch. So could you take a minute or two and tell us about yourself, what you do, and how you got in the industry?
Yeah, that's fine. So I actually got in the industry by doing a degree in disaster management and emergency planning at Coventry University. And then since then, I've worked in various public sector organisations, from a large NHS acute trust to a local resilience forum, county council. Then I moved to London and to work for a borough council, and now I'm actually at Moorfields Eye Hospital as the emergency planning lead. So I worked in various different sectors of the public sector, working in emergency planning and business continuity.
Oh, it's great. It's a pleasure to have you here on the show.
Thank you.
Now, let's jump straight into things. Can you clarify something for us? Because sometimes it seems as though the line is blurred. What's the difference between public and private sectors?
So in terms of emergency planning and business continuity, I think the major difference is public sector emergency planning is very much at the forefront. We have a responsibility to keep our residents safe, and we don't as much think about how we keep our organisation safe, whereas private sector are all about keeping your organisation safe, because they don't have the responsibilities that public sector organisations do. So I think that's the main difference between the two. Also, in public sector, we usually have one team doing emergency management and business continuity. And as I've just said, because emergency management gets a lot more weight, then business continuity ends up being something that you kind of go, oh, we've got an audit coming up, we better do a bit on that. Whereas we very much focus on your emergency planning type incidents. The budget, I would say, public sector organisations obviously have a very limited budget, and not as much is given to emergency planning, as you are kind of sometimes seen as the team that you have to have because there's a legal requirement, but you never want to use. Unfortunately, in the past couple of years, emergency planning teams have been used quite a lot, especially in 2017 in London, where we had quite a few incidents. Mm-hmm. I think also in the public sector, we don't just sit in a room and validate our plans. We do have to use them in reality. I've had many a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning to say a property needs evacuating due to a fire, there's residents out on the street, what are you going to do for them? Whereas up till now, potentially private sectors haven't had to respond to major incidents because of the nature of their work. Obviously, COVID has now changed that, and we're all responding to an incident. So I think they're the main things, but emergency planning is very much the forefront of public sector organisations.
So how do you go about creating those plans for the public sector? For private sector, what tends to happen is they'll do some sort of an assessment and have one person go around and do a bunch of interviews. fill in a template and, there we go. And you mentioned audit, and a lot of times that's the only reason they're doing it for, for creating those plans is for audit or and compliance reasons. But how does the public sector then go about with, because you mentioned limited budgets,
Yeah.
and you get calls at all times and you have to review those plans. And of course, me being a member of the public, I want to make sure, what you're doing protects me. So how do you
Yeah.
go about creating those?
So in my last job working in a London borough, we had an assurance process which set out how we had to update our plans. So most of them were on a 3-yearly review, unless you have an incident, and then we update them. So emergency planning plans are a lot easier to update because it's the kind of sexy stuff, if you like. You get the police involved, you've got the helicopters coming in. People want to help you update them. People want to update a mass fatalities plan, a flu pandemic plan. So it's easier to get the engagement for people to help you write it and for them to take time out to write it and then exercise. Business continuity, on the other hand, because it's seen as the secondary part of emergency planning, we as the professionals in the public sector can't write the plans for them. So it's not a case of us going around questioning the different services. In my last role, we had over 100. We have to go and make them fill out the forms, which when that is number 50 on their list and they're already so busy, it just gets dropped and dropped and dropped. And then you get the audit come round and it's, okay, we really need to do it, but the plans aren't necessarily fit for purpose because they've been wrote for an audit.
I'm interested in something you said there, 3-year reviews.
Yeah.
That's interesting because in business continuity, all the standards and all the guiding bodies that are out there, say everything has to be annual. You've got to do it every year, blah, 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 blah. Even when there's no changes in your organization, you got to do it every year. But emergency management, who looks after people, and responds to, I don't want to say for the most part, people issues, but obviously, with more people involved,
Yeah.
It's every 3 years. How do you explain, or what are your thoughts on that gap?
So that is one of the challenges actually when you are doing emergency planning and business continuity, because you're going to the different services and saying you need to update your plan every year because that's what business continuity says, but then you're also going to the certain services that assist with emergency planning and saying actually we don't need you to update the plan for 3 years because of the 3-yearly cycle. So it is a challenge to get over that. People seem to think we're putting more work on them to make them update their own plan every year, whereas the plans that we hold and we just ask for advice, we only update every 3 years. So there is that kind of difference between the two, which is very hard to overcome, especially when you're asking people to add more to their workload. Mm-hmm. I think the reason emergency plans, especially in the organisation where I've worked and as part of kind of the regional framework, is every 3 years, is because we never want to use them. They're plans that are for mass fatality incidents, or you would use on a kind of Grenfell scale. I imagine everyone is aware of the Grenfell disaster that happened. So you don't want to ever use them, whereas an IT failure or your staff have gone short for whatever reason is something that you do on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Whereas for emergency planning, we never want to invoke those plans. So I think that's why there is the difference between the two cycles of updating.
Yeah, you mentioned regular use. Someone's not available, a key IT person or a system failure. To me, a lot, well, depending on the scope and scale, but a lot of that can end up being daily business as usual incident management practices. Yeah. Rather than we need to declare disaster and crisis, and go crazy. And with business continuity plans, it's incident management. We have 4 hours to investigate. We have another hour to do this, so, calm your jets. You don't have that 4 hours or an additional hour in emergency management, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Because you have your response time it's almost zero. You've got to be there right away.
Yeah, especially when we're on call. So in my current job, I don't have to be on call, which is nice, not worrying about being woken up in the night, but we provide so many numbers for them to call, because if an emergency incident happens, you need to respond, as you said, so quickly, because people's lives are at risk. Mm-hmm. Whereas an IT outage, yes, it's an issue. It could cause a massive issue further down the road, but is anyone's life at stake with that? Probably not, depending on what the situation carries on, especially where I am now, being in a hospital, that probably could cause issues. But 9 times out of 10, it's just a bit annoying for the staff that can't get the system. Whereas a fire burning in a house, there's people at stake.
With business continuity, they say, look at your plans every year, annual update every year, and also exercise them every year. Yeah. If your emergency management plans have a 3-year cycle, and let's say, fingers crossed, it's every 3 years, let's think happy path, right? No disasters, emergencies. Do you still exercise those plans annually?
So for example, we recently, a couple of years ago now, updated the flu pandemic plan for internal, multi-agency and our excess deaths plan. I think it was in 2018, which was quite strange. Coming a year later, we've got a pandemic, and we validated and exercised all those plans. We don't do plan-specific training throughout the year. We do generic incident management, crisis management training. So we'll do a scenario with our crisis support team, our volunteers, or the staff who are on call, and run through your typical incidents. Because I have found, if you start doing these massive, elaborate incidents, which quite honestly don't happen, when you get your normal type incident, staff kind of, in a way, don't know how to react, because it's so small from what they've been trained on and exercised on, that they don't really know how to react to it. So yes, every 3 years we do the plan specific exercising, but throughout the year we do what we would call our typical incident exercising.
Is that now I'm going from some of the things that I see here in my city where I live. They will announce, if you see all these fire trucks and police in this area, don't worry about it. There's no incident. They're testing their incident, response plans. Is that the kind of thing you're alluding to? You just kind of go through a mock simulation, but not on a massive scale.
I'd love to say we would do live incidents. They're very much around a table, going through them. It's something that I think, as all emergency management professionals, we would love to do live exercises, but just the amount of time it puts on teams when there's only, say, 3 of you in a team, putting together a whole live exercise and then bringing in all the other resources, it just doesn't fit the agenda at times. So tabletop exercises, it's easier to get those people in the room, and it still does what we need it to do. A live exercise would be amazing, and I know that they do them on regional based live exercises every so many years, but then there's so much more planning going into it, and there's so much more people to assist. But organisation specific, it's one of those things. We'd love to do it, but we just can't.
Yeah, that would make sense. I know the reason why I brought that up is last year our city had one of these incidents. Well, actually, it was before the pandemic. Yeah. They couldn't do it obviously then, but before the pandemic they had it, and there were some people calling into the local radio stations and police departments, thinking that it was a real situation, because they had people bandaged up, and mock blood and things like that, and thought there's something massive going on, and some people were starting to panic. Yeah. But so that's why I was kind of wondering, is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
So in 2015 or 16, I believe there was one that was a regional one, but it was very much in an old building, and it simulated a tube accident. But it was all contained to one building, so none of the live play exercise was available to be seen by the public. So things like that do happen. but just when you've got such a small team, it's just we've got other priorities, and the tabletop exercises work how we want them to. So,
well, I guess working in a hospital too, by pulling people away from, let's say, I'm not saying this is the person involved, but pulling a head nurse away from the nurse's station or having a doctor involved could potentially put the life of someone in jeopardy, because you're pulling a key resource away from one of the things you're planning for to make sure they're there for.
Yeah. So especially, how it will work in a hospital is you do all your training around their days off, or when they have clinical support days. So where they do all their mandatory training, they get half a days every so many months. So you have to fit in with them. So you're not pulling them away from patients, because patients are our main priority in a hospital. So that's how it will work. Although administration and those kind of people, it's easier to get tabletop exercises, but definitely for the nurses, we fit in with them, so they still get the training, but we're not putting our patients at risk. And
then once you've had your tabletop test, you pull out, well, you already have these plans in front of you, and you like identify the gaps and update, or I'm a big believer of never hitting the delete key in emergency plans. It's just, we've identified another potential action, because a different situation can come along, and that thing that you hit the delete key on suddenly becomes applicable, but it's not in your plan, so people have forgotten it.
Definitely. And with business continuity, I very much like it to be, you've lost your staff, you've lost your building. It doesn't matter why you've lost your staff or your building, because if people start planning for the specifics, if something outside that remit happens, then people do sometimes panic and don't know what to respond to, because it's not set out in their plan. So you're just planning that you've lost your building. It doesn't matter why, just write down what you would do. So that's one of my things that I try and get across, especially with staff absences. Everyone goes, we've lost them because of illness. You might lose them because of a train disruption, or it's the end of the annual leave calendar and everyone's got leave to take. Everyone does business continuity planning then, but they don't necessarily know they're doing it. So that's try and get staff to think about when they're doing these plans.
I'm glad you made mention of the, sometimes people get so focused on the trigger, why they've lost their facility, that they can end up going down a rabbit hole. And their plan only seems to address that one perfect little situation. And then 2 weeks later, you've got, you mentioned a train situation, the tube or subway, for anyone who didn't know what tube was, the subway, isn't working. All of a sudden, you've got people maybe stuck in trains, because they can't move, or, they're waiting at the station, and you've still lost people. But you focus more on, some other situation,
And especially working in central London, the majority of people either get a tube or a subway or an overground train into work. So that is a very possible issue that we face, especially with our weather. Only last week, we had issues with patients not coming in because of the trains, and staff sometimes not being able to get in. It was -5, but our transport system starts to shut down. So whereas other people will find that slightly amusing, that even if it's minus, as you said, where you are, it's -22, yet your public transport still works. So for us, that's a major issue, probably more than losing staff because of a pandemic.
Yeah, it's really interesting how we can all have the same situation, but because of where we're located, where we have different levels of preparedness, we respond differently, and we act differently when we encounter the same situation.
Yeah, definitely.
That's why right now people in Texas, in the US, who's had snowstorms, freezing temperatures, in Texas, which is always warm, and hot. I've been there, and suddenly, they're experiencing some of what we experience here up in Canada, the Great White North. So it's, very, very bizarre. They're not acclimatized to it, and they're not prepared for it.
Yeah, and also it's to do with people's resilience. if you're not used to a certain situation and it happens, however much you plan for it, you don't have that mindset. So I think a lot to do with business continuity and emergency planning is knowing the kind of scope of what incidents you're going to get, accepting you might get a few outside that, but really understanding it. So when they do happen, however unlikely, you're in that mentality that you can respond to it, even if you've never experienced it before.
Well, I want to ask, I know we're talking about emergency planning and business continuity planning. Is there a point where one ends, the other one starts? How do you transition from one to the other? Because in business continuity, there is the thought, emergency management is, for the most part, I'm simplifying it, of course, get the people out of the building. We have assembly locations, you've got floor wardens, and then somebody is the key focal point for the first responders, and then they take over. And emergency management, because I also sit on the advisory board of directors for the International Emergency Management Society teams, and they have a different perspective of what business continuity is. They don't even bring it into their picture. It's like, no, this is what we focus on.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your opinion, where one leads into the other, or should they even?
Yeah, I definitely think they do lead in one into the other. So I think up till a couple of years ago, it was very much seen that in public sector, emergency management is all about your residents. That's what we're trying to keep safe. Business continuity is about keeping our organisation safe, but we're potentially not as great at doing that as we are about our residents. I think then 2017 happened, especially, and we had Grenfell, we had all the terrorist incidents, and a lot of those started as an emergency management issue, obviously Grenfell building on fire, but the aftermath and the recovery had such an impact on those organisations that it became a business continuity issue once all the residents had been kind of rehoused and all that work had been done with them. The organisation still had to recover, and there were still teams dealing with it for months and months, which then meant they couldn't do their internal activities. I think COVID has really highlighted that. Yes, to us, it feels like it should be emergency management because it's the people, it's the flu pandemic plan, that's very much emergency management. But actually, we've had staff off, you've got services that you can't open, like libraries, sports centres. That's become a very much business continuity incident for organisations based on that you can't provide certain activities, there's loss of revenue. And I think this has really highlighted that they shouldn't be seen as two silos. They very much dovetail together, not for every incident, but for quite a lot of them, they will always dovetail together. And that's what you can now try and use in public sector to get people to understand business continuity more. I think COVID has really helped that issue, if I'm honest. I'm making people aware that business continuity isn't just some boring thing that they have to fill out a form for. It's actually really important.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're going to talk more about dovetailing a little later. I'd like to talk about getting buy-in, top level buy-in. How do you go about getting that? Because that seems to be really, ever since I started, 23 years ago, a continuous, ongoing challenge for so many. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think first we need to define what we mean by top level buy-in. So do we want top level buy-in to be a chief executive who knows there is a team there? Or do we want it to be a chief executive who knows the team are there, but is engaged in what they do, trickles it down from the top so that the people that report up to the chief exec are aware of it and champion the program? And I think that's what we want. I think having top level buy-in that's just, it's another tick box, it's something we have to have because there's legislation around it. Yes, it is top level buy-in, but I don't think it's the top level buy-in that we want or we need to get these business continuity programs off the ground.
I think that's interesting, the way you just said that. Is it awareness or is it actual participation?
Yeah.
because I don't know, and maybe you can explain this. Is there a difference between the emergency management side and business continuity? Because business continuity, oh my goodness, you have to do all these presentations. You have to get their buy-in on every single thing you do. And yet
Yeah.
I don't know too many other industries that constantly do that, but business continuity does. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are between emergency management, business continuity, and this buy-in.
So sometimes in some organisations, what makes it more complicated is that you have two directors accountable for emergency management and business continuity. Usually the director that you report up to is responsible for emergency planning, and then usually the director for the corporate services, which emergency management and business continuity teams don't usually sit under, especially in councils, you usually sit under public protection, but they then have responsibility for business continuity. So sometimes you can have two directors having accountability for what one team is doing, but they're very separate in where they sit within the council. And again, then they can have very different ideas for how they want the programme to go, which is not a bad thing, but sometimes that then can create issues when you're trying to push the agenda in one meeting. So we have emergency planning business continuity meetings, we don't split them out. So then having the two directors can create some issues around pushing both agendas forwards.
So how do you go about bringing those together? Because in your topic title, it's a business continuity professional's biggest foe, ? So how do you go about bringing those together so that you're not foes?
So I think one of our major issues is that sometimes we create more issues for ourselves. We can see directors as this massive hurdle or this massive wall that we have to get through in order to get our agenda across or progress the programme. And actually, we don't use them to how we should be. We see them as a challenge. And then that creates more issues because where you're butting heads all the time, you as the professional see them as a brick wall. They want to help most of the time and want to engage, but you're not letting them. So I think we need to actually see them as somebody who can help us progress the programme across the council or across the NHS. And just because they are in different parts of the organisation doesn't mean that they can't come together with the team and we can create a programme that has everything, especially since COVID has blurred the lines so much between the two. I think it's even more important for us not to see those directors as a challenge and as a hurdle for us to get through. I think one of the things is as emergency management officers, we did in my previous job, we had a director on call all the time. So we liaise with them, we do training around emergency management, we have quite good relationships with them because at 2 o'clock in the morning you need to. We all know how it feels to be woken up probably at 2 o'clock in the morning. So those relationships have to be there. But I think when we start looking at business continuity, we forget that we have those relationships and we forget that actually the directors do want to help us and do see us as subject matter experts. But because everyone's a bit hesitant about business continuity, we kind of forget about all of that and then create more issues for ourselves.
So what kind of things, let's say it's me, I'm the business continuity person, your emergency management in the public sector, what kind of things should I do and maybe not do, to help us work together so that we're on the same page, even though we have some different focuses, we know how we link together and how we need to work together?
So I think one of the things is finding common ground. So in emergency management and business continuity, there is common ground and our plan should always reflect that and should work out. So there'll be certain services across the organisation that we use heavily in emergency management, but actually in a business continuity instance would be heavily involved as well. And those need to dovetail together. I think in some ways, emergency management and business continuity are very siloed. And I think that's one of the major issues. If they dovetail together, which I think is coming in the public sector, especially as teams now have responsibility for emergency management and business continuity, they are starting to dovetail together. And I think the more incidents we have where they do dovetail together, the more it makes sense to the organisation, to the directors who have accountability. They know where they stand with the programmes, they know where their role is and how they can actually help champion the programme, because it's very well having a team of 3 or 4 people cheerleading the way for business continuity, but we need that director to champion it, and sometimes emergency management does overpower business continuity. Again, as we've said, in public sector, it's about the residents. We sometimes forget about looking after ourselves. So I think that's really the key.
Well, it's interesting. You just said sometimes emergency management overpowers business continuity. Is that more related to the incident itself? Because the business continuity people, let's say myself, is, well, I got to get the system up and running. I got to get people available to do X, Y, and Z. But emergency management can say, it's not safe to do that. You are not going to that area where there's a chemical spill or whatever the case may be. You are not sending people there to do that. So how do you know who takes the lead in any situation? How is that identified?
So I think thankfully in all the organisations I've worked in, there's been one team doing both situations. So we would respond to your 2 a.m. incidents. We obviously get incidents at other times, and we would also respond to those business continuity incidents. However, there is an issue about when do we get involved in business continuity incidents. We don't want to be involved in your service level business continuity instance. The service needs to deal with that. They're best placed to deal with that. We wouldn't at 2 a.m. when we get a call from the fire brigade go, we'll pass it on to another team. We're the most qualified to deal with that. So I think it's working out when the team gets involved in a business continuity incident and when it's just left to that individual service to respond to it. And they have a plan, or they should have a plan for it. I think that's something that still hasn't been fully bottomed out, knowing where we come in and assist and what those levels of escalation are. I think that's one of the challenges that we have to figure out where the escalation is and how that happens.
Yeah, I find that a lot with different situations. You read about it, hear about it, is, this process dovetails this one dovetails that, but where does that start?
Yes.
How does it start? It's easy to say I can dovetail, off of emergency management, or emergency management can dovetail off of me, but where's that starting point to know, right?
I think that's very well established in emergency management in the public sector, because we've got the legislation around it. We know what we do, whereas we don't have any. We've got the good practice guidelines, but we don't have the equivalent of the Civil Contingencies Act, which basically tells us how we should respond. So I think that's also the issue. There's nothing we can put in front of a director to say, if you don't do it, there'll be repercussions other than just that the business will stop performing how it should do. And sometimes that's not enough, especially with the different politics that you get in public sector. Saying that just isn't going to cut it some of the time.
It's interesting you mentioned good practice guidelines and some of the regulations. And I can't help but think about the different languages that are being used. And you talked about that in your presentation, and one of the points you have is not using business continuity speak.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little more?
So I think, I've done this myself, gone into a training session to deliver business continuity training to people that quite frankly think they have better things to do, and probably do, but they need to do the training, and just gone in there and done everything that I've learned at university, spoke how we all spoke at uni, with all the different languages, the acronyms, and they just look at you like you've got two heads. I think we wouldn't go to a different country and expect them to speak our language. If you go to another country, you either learn the language or you just get by. So why do we go into training sessions with people that don't know a lot about business continuity and expect them to understand everything I'm saying? It took me years to understand the different acronyms. I think it's an issue in emergency management, but I think that's been overcome by some of the JESSUP principles, which are the Joint Emergency Services principles. So police and fire had the same 3-letter acronym, but they spelled completely different things. So I think we really need to learn from that and learn that not everyone knows what we're talking about and make it relevant to them. Talk to them in a way that they understand. And I've done that myself, gone in and just talked how I think they should understand, and they haven't, and it gets you nowhere.
Yeah, I've been a victim of that as well. I think anybody worth their salt, weight in salt, it would say that, that we've all done that. I read about it, and sometimes it's called the curse of knowledge. You know what you're saying, you know what you want to say, but you have to make an additional step of converting what you're saying so that everybody understands it. So that your monologue can become dialogue with someone. Otherwise, it's What?
So a prime example, I was doing my, so I did a placement year in between my second and third year degree. So I was still an undergraduate. I went into an NHS acute trust, and I was going around checking all the business continuity boxes, and people just didn't care. And I realised it was because it was called business continuity and not patient safety. So the boxes were around the patients. We were just calling them what we thought they would just be called. But the nurses and doctors are all about patient safety, and quite rightly. So just changing it from let's check the business continuity box to let's check the patient safety box. And people just fully engaged even more with me. And it was just some simple language that went from no engagement to them really engaging and understanding why it was needed.
So that goes back to your point earlier on, speaking their language so that they understand what it is you're trying to convey, but at the same time, by you changing your language, you understand what's important to them.
Yeah, and that's something, so in the public sector, we can't write the plans for them. We don't understand the services and departments to a level, and we don't have time to go and understand them to that level. So the thing that you need is to understand what is the most critical thing to that service and go in at that angle, and then it fully resonates and relates to them. And that's how you then get the engagement and you get over those challenges that at the beginning seem impossible.
Now, we've got 10 minutes left, but 9 minutes left, but I know you want to touch on COVID.
Yes.
So, because you had some success stories and you have some points that you wanted to bring up with COVID. So.
Yeah, so when I was doing my presentation, I thought it'd be really naive of me not to mention COVID. It's had such an impact on all our lives. And I feel it's been very negative in the press, the media, and how people perceive it. And quite rightly, it's a horrible disease which is completely gone worldwide. But I think there are positives that we can take from COVID and how we're going to implement how we work in the future. So obviously I've just started at Moorfields Eye Hospital, but last year they were looking at how they can get patients in, seen and out quickly. Social distancing doesn't allow for that many patients in a hospital. And so we have glaucoma and medical retina clinics. And previously these would take for one patient between 3 and 4 hours to be seen. They'd do the test, the consultants would look at them, they'd then go back to the patient. So they devised a diagnostic hub, which is a completely separate building, and the patients can have all their tests done within 45 minutes. The results are then emailed to the consultants, and the consultants look through them at a later date and then phone the patients that need the most attention or need a medical attention quite quickly. So this has increased our attendance by 2,700 people per month. And as one of the leading eye specialist hospitals, that's quite a lot more patients that we can actually see. And that has all been as a result of COVID and trying to work out how is the most efficient and safest way to see our patients when we have staff redeployed elsewhere. So that's been a very big success story, which they're looking at using in future planning and how we can actually keep this going, as it has been such a success.
Nice. Now, sorry, just wanted to write that down so I didn't forget it. That you don't hear too many success stories in COVID right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's also allowed us to get through some of the backlog that we've had as a result of having to put patients on hold while we deal with the pandemic. Being in the NHS, as much as we're a specialist hospital, we've sent staff to other hospitals to help on intensive care wards. So we've had to scale down, even though we've not been impacted because we're not on acute. And then the second example was we did a cataract drive. So mostly cataract surgery is quite low on our scale. It doesn't have massive consequences if you don't have it done within a certain time, but for certain people who do a lot of driving for work, the implications can be quite substantial. So we opened all our theatres for 1 week and saw over 720 eyes during that week, and did just a whole week of cataract surgery, which got through some of the backlog. Our surgeons were working different shifts and just enabled us to see those patients that we hadn't been able to see because we had redeployed staff. And we were giving COVID tests out on their day that they came in for pre-surgery, so they don't have to wait when they come in for the actual surgery. I mean, the patients felt a lot safer and more willing to come into a hospital. So, and again, this is something that we're going to look at seeing if we can future plan for it and keep doing this, as it's a good way of getting through all our patients in 1 week and managing that backlog from COVID. But also it's been very successful, and the patient feedback has been really good, that they felt supported throughout and that the system actually really worked. So there's just 2 examples of how we've had to adapt to COVID, but this can now become our normal business as usual at some point.
Is there the potential, I'm not going to put you on the spot, potential to be able to carry that kind of process into other areas? I'll say a silly one, ingrown toenails. Anyone with an ingrown toenail can all come in during this 1 week. Is there the potential of using that same kind of strategy in other areas?
So for us, because we're so specialist in being an eye hospital, there's only certain procedures that probably can wait and be deferred. So most of the people that we see, it's for life, it's kind of sight saving, or in a way life saving, as we have an oncology department. So probably across what we do, there's not many where we can replicate it other than the cataract. And the diagnostic hub, again, we only use for glaucoma and medical retina, but we can then replicate that across our sites in London. So we probably can't replicate it across services, but we can definitely look at how we can replicate some of it across our satellite sites and create more sites.
But that approach, I think the approach you're using could be utilized by other institutions. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to put you on the spot saying yes they should or anything like that, but you've created a model that maybe others could look at and say, hey, maybe we could do that for, like I said, toenails or something.
So across other trusts, it could be something that is replicated.
Oh, that's good. It's good to hear. It's nice to hear some success stories with COVID, considering it's so negative.
Yeah, and certainly things that we're looking at putting into our long-term planning. So it's not, we've realised there's an issue during COVID, we've dealt with it, but we're not going to look at it again. We're actively looking at how we can incorporate it once we're all back to a new normal and see if it's something that we can carry on.
We've only got 2 minutes left. Would you like to take a minute and a half with any final thoughts on emergency management and business continuity and, the foe?
Yeah, so I think for me, business continuity is very much about getting over those challenges, but also about accepting there will be challenges. I think if you come in to the sector and think, I'm going to implement a business continuity program within 6 months, it's going to be fine, everyone's going to love it and engage with it, I think you're setting yourself up for issues. Whereas if you step back, look at what your challenges might be, and they will differ from organisation to organisation, and actually put a roadmap in place, it sets you up for getting that program in, but understanding what hurdles you'll have. I think the biggest one is dovetailing. Make sure your business continuity plans dovetail, because it's fine having 100 plans working in silo, but it's going to fall down in an incident. People need to talk to each other and understand everyone's requirements. So yeah, understand your challenges and get people talking would be my kind of thoughts on how to implement a good business continuity program.
I like your comment about the 6 months to put a program together or something together. I've been in that situation, and then my contract ends and they leave, and even though I leave a big list, okay, if this is what you got to take and do moving forward, otherwise it's not going to work. And you check back later on, and the person that was supposed to take it over is gone, the director is gone. You're like, I did all that work for you to protect you, to help you, and you're not there anymore. It makes you wonder, was it worth it?
Yeah.
In the end, so that 6 months thing, I've been there, and unfortunately, I wish I could see it through longer and further,
Yeah.
and make sure everyone's successful, but oh well. Juliana, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and time today. I really appreciate it. And I know you mentioned you're having a rainy day there in London. So,
Yeah.
and minus 20 degrees here where I am. So opposite ends here.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you again for sharing everything with us and your comments and input. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope a lot of people can take some things away from our chat here. And to everybody who is watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.